Damian was a tall, athletic young boy with sharp facial features, piercing silver eyes, and jet black, slightly messy hair that fell just above his shoulders. Even at 12, he carried himself with a calm yet determined expression, exuding an air of quiet strength. Unlike his older brother Jason, who adored the might of the sword, Damian had an affinity with a bow, a weapon that was often ridiculed as weak and cowardly. Jason, though only a year older, already had the build of a warrior in the making. He was strong for his age, broad-shouldered, with short, spiky brown hair and eyes filled with arrogance and calculation. Jason prided himself on his skill with the sword, and he took every opportunity to show off his strength. However, deep down he feared Damian, not for his physical prowess but for his mind. Damian was sharp, observant, and studious, qualities that their father, Baron Eldrick, often praised in a future leader. This fear gnawed at Jason, manifesting in jealousy and cruelty. Damian had always been different from his brother. While Jason spent his days training in the courtyard, swinging a wooden sword with brutish force, Damian was methodical. He studied the history of war, the strategies of great generals, and the mechanics of different weapons. He read by candlelight deep into the night, scribbling notes on battle formations and enemy weak points. But no matter how much effort he put in, Jason always found a way to ruin it. On more than one occasion, Damian would return to his small study only to find his notes torn apart, ink splattered across pages he had painstakingly written. Jason would stand nearby with his friends, sneering, "No amount of books will help you win a real fight, little brother. Maybe you should spend less time with ink and more with steel." When it came to combat, Jason's bullying was even more direct. Their sparring matches were never fair. Jason made sure of that. He would swing harder than necessary, aiming not just to win but to humiliate. If Damian managed to dodge or counter, Jason would shove him to the ground, sneering, "Cowards dodge, warriors fight head-on." Their father, watching from a distance, would simply shake his head. "Damian, stop running around and fight properly." But Damian had no choice but to rely on his agility. He was quick, far quicker than Jason, able to evade heavy strikes with ease. His archery was unmatched. Even the knights of the household admitted that they had never seen such precision in a boy so young. He could strike a moving target at impossible distances, hit the same mark multiple times in succession, and even curve his shots around obstacles, using the terrain to his advantage. But none of that mattered to Jason or the other nobles. A sword was the weapon of a warrior, a bow, a tool for cowards. Despite the ridicule, Damian never let bitterness take root in his heart. He was kind to the household servants, the stable boys, the cooks, people Jason dismissed as beneath him. When Jason would mock or order them around, Damian would step in, helping where he could, offering kind words when no one else did. The servants adored him, whispering their hopes that he, not Jason, would one day inherit their father's land. Jason saw this as yet another threat. The people in the household respected Damian, while they merely feared Jason. He knew his father valued intelligence in a ruler, and though he had been granted the birthright of inheritance as the eldest, what if his father changed his mind? What if he saw Damian's potential and chose him instead? That thought alone was enough to fuel Jason's hatred. He had to ensure Damian never got the chance to challenge him, and soon that opportunity would come. In this world, noble children were granted special magic on their 10th birthday, a tradition deeply rooted in their kingdom's history. The awakening ceremony was a grand event where a seer, an ancient mage blessed with foresight, would reveal the talent each child possessed. Talents were categorized into two types: combat and non-combat. Combat talents included warriors, knights, battle mages, and assassins, roles of power and prestige. Non-combat talents, though necessary for governance and trade, were seen as lesser, often leading to a life of obscurity. When Jason's ceremony arrived, the hall was filled with anticipation. The seer, an elderly man clad in ceremonial robes, stepped forward, placing his hand upon Jason's forehead. A blinding golden light erupted from Jason's body, and a powerful aura filled the hall. The seer's voice rang out, "Swordmaster." The crowd erupted in cheers. It was one of the most prestigious combat talents, granting Jason an unparalleled affinity for the sword. His father's face lit up with pride, his broad smile showing his satisfaction. Nobles and commoners alike praised Jason, lauding him as a prodigy destined for greatness. Jason, basking in the admiration, swelled with pride. His arrogance, once subtle, became unchecked. No longer needing to hide his cruelty, he tormented Damian openly, knowing their father would make excuses for his actions. After all, Jason was the heir, the future leader. His strength justified his every action. A year passed, and now it was Damian's turn. Despite Jason's mistreatment, many still held hope for Damian. The servants whispered prayers for him, and the villagers believed his kindness would be rewarded. He entered the grand hall, where the same seer stood waiting. As the seer's hand touched Damian's forehead, an unnatural flicker of shadow danced across the floor. Then, without warning, A cloud of thick black smoke enveloped him. Gas echoed throughout the room as the darkness swirled before dissipating. The seer's voice, this time uncertain, spoke the words, "Phantom Archer." A heavy silence followed, murmurs of confusion and disappointment spread through the crowd. Unlike Jason's golden radiance, Damian's awakening had been shrouded in shadow, ominous and unorthodox. The title of Phantom Archer was unheard of, lacking the prestige of Swordmaster. Jason's scoff was the first to break the silence. A coward's talent for a coward's weapon, he sneered. Laughter followed from his friends and supporters, and soon, the entire hall buzzed with hushed disapproval. Their father's face twisted in disappointment, his excitement from a year ago now replaced with disdain. A bow was not a weapon of leadership. A talent steeped in shadows could not be trusted. Damian was not the son he had hoped for. That evening, Damian was summoned to his father's study. Without ceremony, a pouch of gold was tossed onto the table. "There is a village in the south called Basincove. You will manage it." Damian stood in shock, understanding the true meaning behind the words. Basincove was a forsaken place, barren, isolated, and overrun by dangers. It was a death sentence disguised as responsibility. His father wanted him out of the way so Jason could take his place without opposition. Damian clenched his fists but did not argue. He had known for years that he was unwanted, that no matter how hard he tried, he would never be enough in his father's eyes. He took a deep breath and picked up the pouch. "Yes, father." His father did not acknowledge his departure, already turning his attention to matters of greater importance. As Damian stepped out into the cold night, he felt the weight of exile pressing down on him. But amidst the sadness, a spark of determination ignited within him. If his father and Jason sought to cast him aside, then he would carve out his own path. He would make Basincove his own, and he would prove them all wrong. Jasmine had always been an anomaly in the estate, an orphan girl of striking beauty with no wealth or noble lineage to claim. Her long platinum blonde hair, silken and radiant, framed her delicate features flowing down her back past her waist, and her deep blue eyes held an ocean's depth of emotion and resilience. From a young age, she had been cast aside by her family, who could not afford to keep her, and was left to fend for herself. She survived on scraps, shivering in the cold corners of alleyways, enduring the jeers and disdain of those who walked past without a second glance. It was Damian who had found her. A mere boy at the time, he had stumbled across her in a forgotten street corner, clutching her knees to her chest, hollow eyes searching for salvation in the unforgiving world. His heart clenched at the sight. Without hesitation, he removed his cloak and draped it over her frail form. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he had said softly. She had looked up at him, expecting cruelty, expecting mockery, expecting what Jason and his friends had given her time and time again. But all she saw was kindness. When Damian had brought her back to the estate, Jason had wasted no time in ridiculing him. "You really are pathetic, little brother." Jason sneered, arms crossed as he looked Jasmine up and down with obvious distaste. "Picking up stray dogs off the street. How noble." The other boys in Jason's group laughed cruelly, their mocking eyes making Jasmine shrink back instinctively. She was painfully aware of the dirt on her skin, the tattered rags she wore, the way she smelled of dust and hunger. Damian, however, had ignored his brother's words. He had simply turned to Jasmine and offered her a warm hand, a silent promise that she was safe with him, and from that day forward she had been by his side. Jason's cruelty didn't stop at words. As the years passed, he became more brazen, cornering Jasmine when Damian wasn't around, pressing himself too close, whispering things that made her skin crawl. But Damian was always there. He would appear before Jason could go too far, his silver eyes cold with warning, his stance protective. Jason would laugh it off, making crude comments before walking away, but his hatred for Damian only grew. Jasmine, however, never forgot. She never forgot how Damian had protected her, how he had treated her as an equal when no one else had. He never acted as though she were beneath him, never saw her as just a servant. He would sneak sweets into her hands when no one was looking, smirking playfully as she gasped in delight. He spoke to her, listened to her thoughts, valued her opinions. He made her feel like she was worth something. So when she heard the news that Damian was being sent away, her heart clenched in panic. He was leaving. She had rushed to the Baron's chambers, barely able to contain her emotions. She knelt before him, desperation evident in her voice. "Please, let me go with him," she pleaded. The Baron looked at with mild interest before scoffing. "And why should I allow that?" Jasmine swallowed her pride, knowing this was her only chance. "He will need someone to manage the household. I can cook, clean, ensure that everything runs smoothly. He shouldn't have to bear this burden alone." For a long moment, the Baron said nothing, simply watching her with unreadable eyes. Then, to her utter shock, he nodded. "Fine, do what you want." That was all she needed to hear. The next morning, as Damian stood by the carriage, preparing for the long journey ahead, Jasmine arrived with her luggage and towel. Her expression was calm, but her grip on the handles was firm. Damian turning. Jasmine, what are you doing? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked past him, placed her bags inside the carriage, then turned and met his gaze with unwavering determination. I'm coming with you, she said simply. Damian's brow furrowed. Jasmine, this isn't some grand adventure. It's dangerous. It's far away from here. It'll be lonely, harsh. I know, she interrupted. He hesitated. I can't guarantee your safety. She tilted her head slightly. And who will guarantee yours? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, momentarily stunned. She had always been like this, calm, resolute, impossible to deter. He sighed. Jasmine? She simply walked past him and climbed into the carriage, sitting down gracefully. She glanced at him expectantly. Are you coming or not? For a moment, Damian simply stared at her. Then, to his own surprise, he felt the corners of his lips tug upwards. Despite everything, despite his exile, despite the uncertainty ahead, he felt lighter, because she was coming with him. With a quiet chuckle, he climbed in beside her. As the carriage pulled away from the estate, he cast one last glance back at the place he had once called home. Then he turned forward, his resolve stronger than ever. He may have been cast aside, but he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The journey to Basincove would take 2 weeks, a grueling trek through rough roads, untamed forests, and isolated stretches of land where civilization was scarce. Damian, however, saw it as the perfect opportunity to master his newly awakened talent. From the moment they left his father's estate, his mind was consumed with understanding the phantom archer abilities he had been granted. On the second evening of travel, after setting up camp for the night, Damian sat apart from the others, staring at his hand as he concentrated. He focused on the strange, dormant energy within him, willing it to manifest. A flicker of darkness seeped from his fingertips, thick and dense like a pool of ink. It coiled around his palm, swirling and shifting, moving as though alive. The longer he concentrated, the stronger the smoke became, pulsating like a living shadow. It absorbed all light around it, a void that seemed endless, an entity both mesmerizing and eerie. Jasmine, who had been tending to the evening's meal, stole a glance at Damian from the fire. She had never seen magic like his before. There was something mysterious about it, something almost unnatural. Yet, despite its ominous appearance, she did not fear it. This was Damian, after all. By the 4th day, Damian's persistence bore fruit. During a short break, while the other travelers rested, he ventured into the nearby forest, drawing upon the shadows once more. He willed the smoke into shape, envisioning an arrow forming in his grip. Slowly, the inky darkness twisted, elongated, and solidified into a sleek, spectral arrow that exuded a faint, unnatural glow. Without hesitation, he knocked it onto the string of his bow and aimed at a small hare in the distance. He released. The arrow flew like a phantom, utterly silent, a streak of black against the green foliage. It struck the hare instantly, and the creature collapsed without a sound. Damian approached cautiously, inspecting the body. There was no wound, no puncture, no blood, no external injury at all. And yet, the life had completely left the creature's body. A chill ran down his spine. The power he wielded was unlike any archer's. His arrow struck not with force, but with something far more elusive, something that defied natural law. He took a deep breath and collected the hare, returning to camp. Jasmine was already busy cooking for the group, her long platinum hair swaying with each movement as she prepared stew for their traveling party. As soon as she saw Damian return with his latest catch, she placed her hands on her hips and frowned. You haven't eaten all day, have you? She asked, already knowing the answer. Damian blinked, glancing at the fresh kill in his grasp. Oui, no excuses. She cut him off, taking the hare and adding it to their growing supply of food. You can obsess over your magic after you eat. A few of the older travelers chuckled knowingly, exchanging amused glances at Jasmine's fussing. She quickly turned away to hide the blush rising in her cheeks, focusing intently on her work. Despite Damian's insistence that he didn't need to be coddled, he always ended up listening to her. He had to admit, though only to himself, that he appreciated her concern, even if she was overbearing about it at times. Thanks to Damian's relentless practice, food was never an issue during their travels. Every day he brought back fresh game, deer, pheasants, and even wild boars. They had so much that they had to make extra room in the carriage to store it, unwilling to waste the bounty. The travelers praised him for his efficiency, some even calling him a blessing on their journey. Though Damian was not one for excessive compliments, he silently took pride in how useful his abilities had proven to be. As their journey continued, Damian honed his skills further, developing 3 distinct techniques: rapid shot, a technique that allowed him to fire multiple arrows in quick succession. With each draw of his bowstring, the shadowy arrows formed instantly, vanishing into the air the moment they were released. The speed and accuracy were unparalleled, allowing him to take down multiple targets in the blink of an eye. Ballista A devastating, armor-piercing shot. Unlike his standard arrows, this one took longer to form, the smoke coalescing into an elongated, spear-like projectile. When fired, it tore through anything in its path, trees, boulders, and even thick steel, as he later tested. Snare, a non-lethal yet incredibly effective ability. When fired, this arrow would not strike to kill. Instead, the shadows extended upon impact, wrapping around the target and binding them in dark chains that tightened with movement. No amount of struggling could break free from its grip until the effect wore off. By the end of the second week, Damian had grown accustomed to his abilities, refining them with each use. The fear and uncertainty he once had were now replaced with a quiet confidence. He was no longer the overlooked younger brother or the supposed disappointment to his father. He was something else entirely. And soon, Basincove would be the first nest to rise of the Phantom Archer. The carriage rumbled along the worn dirt path, passing through barren fields and tangled undergrowth as it approached the village of Basincove. Damian sat at the window, his piercing silver eyes scanning the land with quiet calculation. To the west and north, the soil was dry and cracked, incapable of yielding any proper harvest. To the south and east, an oppressive forest loomed, thick with towering trees and crawling with unseen dangers. And where the two biomes met in the northeast, a treacherous swamp festered, created by the land's harsh contrast of arid and overabundant moisture. Damian knew from his studies that beyond the southern forest lay a vast lake, a precious resource that could provide fresh water and fish, but reaching it was another matter entirely. The forest was home to vicious beasts, and more than that, the villagers were too afraid to make the journey. The village's struggles were immediately clear, cut off from resources, surrounded by danger, and left to rot in neglect. As the carriage rolled into the heart of Basincove, the villagers gathered, watching with cautious curiosity. They were gaunt, their faces sunken with malnutrition, their clothes patched and worn. Most had the same wary expression, one of quiet endurance. To them, nobles only ever meant higher taxes and harsher demands. Was this new arrival any different? The door of the carriage swung open, and Damian stepped out, his cloak billowing behind him. Jasmine followed closely, her long platinum hair flowing as she took in the sight before them. Silence hung in the air. A man stumbled out of the largest house in the village, or what should have been the largest. The wooden structure was rotting, its windows cracked, its door barely hanging on its hinges. The man himself looked little better. Marcus, the one in charge of Basincove, was a portly man with deep bags under his eyes, his hair unkempt from stress and exhaustion. His eyes widened when he saw Damian, and for a moment he simply stood there, his lips quivering. Then, as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders, he nearly collapsed onto his knees. "You've come, Ick," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've actually come." Damian regarded him carefully. He had expected resistance, even hostility. But this was pure relief. Marcus pulled himself together, standing and turning to the gathered villagers. His voice, though shaky, carried authority. "A meeting!" Everyone gathered. The villagers exchanged glances before slowly forming a crowd. Some stood with crossed arms, their expression skeptical. Others murmured among themselves, already forming doubts. When the last of them had gathered, Marcus took a deep breath and spoke. "This is Damian, son of the noble house, and he has been sent here to manage Basincove." The reaction was immediate. More murmurs, more doubts. Damian looked over the crowd, his sharp eyes studying them. He saw the wariness in their expressions, the years of suffering that had hardened them against false promises. He heard their quiet doubts whispered between them. "He's just a child. If he was sent here, that means he's unwanted. What leadership could he offer? Is he going to tax us like the last one?" Damian heard them all. The suspicion, the exhaustion, the fear. These people had been abandoned too many times to trust easily. He needed to change that. Stepping forward, he raised his voice so all could hear. "I understand your doubts." His tone was calm but firm. "I am not here to take from you. I am here to fix what has been broken. But I can't do that alone." He turned to the carriage, motioning to the servants. They pulled back the covers to reveal a bounty of fresh meat, dozens of hunted animals from his journey. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It had been so long since they had seen this much food at once. "For tonight," Damian continued, "we eat. All of us. No one will go to bed hungry." A hush fell over the villagers, their suspicion flickering with something unfamiliar hope. Jasmine stepped forward, already taking charge. "I need those who know how to cook. Let's make this a meal worth remembering." A few women hesitated before stepping forward, then a few more. The promise of food was enough to thaw the tension, if only for now. Fires were lit, meat was prepared, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the scent of a real feast filled the air. Damian watched as the people slowly relaxed, talking and laughing between bites of well-seasoned meat and warm stew. For now, leadership didn't matter. His title didn't matter. Only this, a village full of people who had suffered enough finding something to celebrate. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, they would feast. The next morning, Damian called for another meeting. This time, he came prepared. He knew the village's biggest problem wasn't just the land or the monsters. It was the lack of organization. They needed a proper structure, a way to use whatever skills they had to improve their situation. With the pouch of gold his father had given him, he saw his opportunity. He gathered the villagers in the center of Basincove, standing atop a crate so all could see him. "I need to know what each of you can do," he declared, his voice steady and firm. "Carpenters, tailors, cooks, craftsmen, whatever skill you have, we need it." The villagers exchanged uncertain glances. Some mumbled among themselves. What was the point? The land was barren, the forest deadly. But then Damian pulled out a single gold coin, holding it high for all to see. "I offer this as a promise," he continued. "Not only will I not tax you, but I will pay you for your work." A stunned silence followed. Gold was nearly worthless in Basincove, but the gesture meant something. For the first time, a noble wasn't taking from them, he was offering something in return. Slowly, hesitantly, the villagers stepped forward. Marcus, Jasmine, and a few others helped take notes, forming 5 lines as people listed their skills. Some were hunters, though they had long given up venturing near the forest. Others were craftsmen who had no materials to work with. A few new farming techniques, though the soil had long since turned to dust. Damian listened carefully, committing each answer to memory. When the census was finished, Damian turned to one of the travelers who had accompanied him. He reached into his pouch and handed the man 15 gold coins. "Take the carriage to the nearest town. Buy saws, axes, farming tools, seeds, cloth, sewing supplies, anything we can use." The man, a grizzled but good-natured traveler named Simon, grinned. "2 gold for me?" he asked, raising a brow. Damian smirked and said, "You get back safely, and I'll make it 3. Simon bowed with a flourish before replying. "Simon at your service, young master!" Damian chuckled and playfully shooed him toward the carriage. "Be safe!" he called after him as Simon disappeared down the road. Over the next few days, Damian threw himself into his work. He surveyed the land, examined the soil, and ventured into the forest to hunt. Every morning he would bring back freshly hunted game, leaving it at the forest's edge for the villagers to retrieve. At first they were hesitant, but as they saw him return unscathed day after day, their fear slowly lessened. A few brave souls even dared to venture closer. At night, Damian pored over hand-drawn maps, sketching plans for the village's future. The eastern land would be converted into farmland, protected by sturdy walls. The north would be designated for livestock, its soil gradually restored with fertilizer and water. The west, with its cliffs and ravines, needed to be explored. His relentless efforts did not go unnoticed. The villagers watched as he worked tirelessly, pushing himself to his limits and beyond. And then it happened. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Damian staggered into the village square, dragging behind him a massive boar, its weight nearly twice his own. The villagers gasped, watching as he strained to pull the carcass forward. Sweat dripped from his brow, his limbs shaking from exhaustion. Yet, even then, his focus remained on them. "Food," he murmured, barely able to keep his balance. "Make sure everyone eats." Then, without warning, his legs gave out. He collapsed to the ground unconscious. For a brief moment, there was stunned silence. Then, Chas. "Damian!" Jasmine was the first to reach him, dropping to her knees beside him. She shook his shoulders, her heart pounding. "Damian, wake up." He didn't respond. His body was completely drained. His hands, once so steady, were limp at his sides. The villagers gathered around, their expressions shifting from shock to realization. "This whole time," one muttered, "he's been the one feeding us." Another clenched his fists. "He's been working himself to exhaustion for us." A woman wiped her eyes, and we still doubted him. Guilt weighed heavily on them. They had been wary, skeptical, uncertain if he truly cared. But now, seeing him collapse from sheer exhaustion, they understood. He wasn't just leading them, he was fighting for them. Jasmine clenched her jaw and turned to the crowd. "Someone get water! Help me get him inside!" That night, as Damian lay unconscious, the village changed. People worried for him, some paced, some but most reflected, vowing to do more. They had promised him they would work together to make the village thrive, but he was doing more than everyone. When he wakes up, not if, they would move forward together. When Damian finally woke the next morning, his head heavy and his body sore, he found Jasmine sitting beside him, her arms crossed and eyes red from lack of sleep. The moment his eyes fluttered open, Jasmine exhaled sharply, relief washing over her features. "You idiot," she muttered, her voice softer than usual. "You scared everyone half to death." He looked at her and sheepishly replied, "Sorry." Jasmine started lecturing him about taking care of himself, but never once stopped taking care of him, getting up to get him porridge, pouring him water, getting a damp cloth to wipe him with. Before she could continue, Damian reached forward, grabbing her wrist and pulling her into a tight embrace. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed as he whispered, "Thank you." Jasmine swallowed hard, her cheeks heating up. Slowly, she buried her face in his neck and hugged him back. "Just don't do it again," she mumbled against his skin. For the first time, Damian wasn't just a noble ruling over a village. He was their leader. The next day, Simon returned with all of the items 13 gold pieces could buy, everything a growing village needed to start thriving. When he arrived, he was surprised to find Damian still resting. Hearing from Jasmine what had happened, he shook his head and spoke in a soft voice so as not to wake him. "I've never seen a noble do so much for anyone, much less a forgotten village like this." Then, turning to Jasmine, he added, "You know he pushes himself like this for you too, right? He doesn't want you suffering more than you have to. Take care of him. We're all behind you for support as well." Jas stared at Simon's departing figure in shock, before turning to Damian, her eyes glistening. Could he care about me that much? Just then, Damian stirred, his body still weak but his mind as sharp as ever. He slowly sat up, and Jasmine immediately rushed to his side to help. He smiled at her, but she could see the exhaustion still clinging to him. Yet, knowing him, he wouldn't rest, not fully at least. When Damian saw the carriage had returned, renewed energy surged through him. This was what he had been waiting for. But first he needed a bath. He turned to Jasmine with a playful grin. She eyed him cautiously. "What? I need to wash up," he said, smirking. "Want to keep holding on while I do that." Instantly, Jasmine smacked his chest, face burning red. She quickly let go of him and rushed toward the door. "I'm going to prepare your meal," she shouted over her shoulder as she fled. Damian chuckled and went to get himself cleaned up. After washing and eating, he gathered everyone and nodded his thanks to Simon. He then displayed the tools, weapons, and supplies Simon had brought, to the amazement and excitement of the villagers. Standing before them, he relayed his plans: farmland to the east, a livestock pen to the north, and timber from the forest. He quickly reassured them that he and the bravest villagers would guard those cutting down the trees. He expected pushback, but after seeing him collapse from exhaustion for their sake, everyone was determined to work even harder. The days that followed were filled labor and progress. The village slowly transformed from a strugglement to a place of hope. Woodcutters, armed with newly acquired saws and axes, ventured into the forest under heavy protection. With each fallen tree, planks were cut, beams prepared, and houses reinforced. Despite their fear, the villagers trusted Damian and his men to guard them. The work was slow but steady, and for the first time in years, the village had sturdy walls being erected for protection. The farmers, grateful for the tools and seeds, began clearing the eastern land, tilling the soil with renewed vigor. Though the ground was barren, Damian assured them that, with time and proper care, it would regain its fertility. He even instructed them on how to mix animal waste with soil to create fertilizer, and soon the first plots of land were ready for planting. Tailors set up workshops, sewing new clothes from the fine cloth Simon had brought. With proper fabric and tools, they mended torn garments and created fresh clothing to help protect the villagers against the elements. Despite the growing optimism, dangers still lurked. Wild beasts occasionally attacked the workers, but the newly trained guards, armed with bows and swords, handled most of the threats with increasing confidence. Damian continued to train the hunters, forming a skilled group dedicated to defending Basincove. For days, various animals tested the village's defenses: wolves, boars, even a rogue bear. But each time, the guards, armed with their bows and blades, held them off. The villagers began to feel a newfound confidence. But then something different came. A drake, the massive beast, its scales like thick black iron, stormed from the depths of the forest, roaring as it charged toward the logging area. The guards, despite their training, found their arrows and swords ineffective against its tough hide. Panic spread as the creature swiped its tail, sending one of the men crashing into a tree. Then, over the chaos, a single voice rang out: "Retreat." Damian's roar cut through the terror, commanding everyone to fall back. The guards hesitated, but his unwavering tone left no room for argument. They withdrew, leaving only Damian standing against the monstrous foe. The villagers gathered at the edge of the forest, watching in horror and awe. Jasmine clutched her chest, fear gripping her as Damian faced the beast alone. The drake roared and dashed at him, but Damian was already moving. He darted through the trees with agility beyond human limits, using the terrain to his advantage. As he ran, shadows coiled around him, swirling with a life of their own. Then, for the first time, the villagers saw it: his phantom archer abilities. Dark energy crackled around his fingers as ethereal arrows formed in his grasp. He knocked and fired in rapid succession, his rapid shot striking the drake's legs again and again, slowing its movements. It roared in frustration, its thick hide absorbing much of the damage. But Damian wasn't done. With a flick of his hand, dart tendrils erupted from the ground, his snare ability. The shadows coiled around the drake's legs, holding it in place just long enough for Damian to prepare his final strike. As Damian's strength grew, so did his skills. A deep, swirling darkness began to gather at his fingertips, condensing into a single massive projectile. The air grew heavy as the black smoke took the shape of a ballista, its shape towering behind him. The villagers held their breath as Damian loosed the shot. The massive shadow bolt tore through the air with devastating force, slamming into the drake's chest. The impact sent a shockwave through the forest, shaking the trees, the villagers feeling the wave of impact even from back there. The beast let out a final, pained shriek. Smoke and shadow swirled around the battlefield as the drake collapsed lifeless. Silence. The villagers stood frozen, eyes locked on the clearing where Damian now stood. As he turned back toward them, the lingering smoke from his ballista slowly dissipated, revealing his silhouette against the setting sun. Awe, wonder, fear. For the first time they truly saw him, not just as their leader, but as something more, a force to be reckoned with. As he approached, a small smile played on his lips. His voice calm despite the exhaustion in his body. The forest won't be a problem anymore. Jasmine released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The villagers exchanged glances. Then, one by one, a cheer started to erupt. But before it could get too loud, Jasmine dashed out from the pack and dove into Damian's arms. She squeezed him so tightly before pounding his chest in worry, frustration, and relief. Suddenly, everyone went quiet, looking on in anticipation. Damian dropped his trusted bow and cupped Jasmine's face in his hands, shocking her, her wide eyes looking up at him just as he leaned forward and kissed her passionately. After a moment of surprise, she hugged him tightly and kissed him back, just as a thunderous cheer arose in the background. As their kiss ended and they returned to reality, Jasmine's face instantly turned red, but she couldn't hide the joyous smile. Damian, not forgetting to pick up his bow, took her hand in his and walked back to the village. That night, everyone tasted drake meat for the first time in another celebration. This happiness seemed to be happening more and more, and all of the villages silently understood it started with Damian. All while Damian was busy explaining his talent to little ones and some adults, who crowded him in curiosity and excitement. Jasmine, sitting by his side watching on with the rest, a happy and content smile on her face. As time passed, small snippets of Basincove's growth started to spread. News of a waterway being built from the lake, the town's rejuvenation and slow growth, exquisite pelts and furs and hides that can be found there. These pieces made their way back to the Baron's estate, to Jason's ears. Especially the news of Damian's success enraged Jason. He could not stand the fact that his cowardly brother was gaining any form of recognition, so he convinced their father to send knights to Basincove under the guise of offering assistance. However, their true purpose was to sabotage Damian's progress and ensure his failure. The knights arrived with the arrogance of men who had never known struggle. Clad in polished armor, their tabards bearing the sigil of House Eldrick, they rode into Basincove as if it were already theirs to rule. Their horses trampled the dirt paths with an air of entitlement, kicking up dust in the faces of villagers who had worked tirelessly to build their new home. Yet, not a single one of them offered so much as an apology. One of the knights, a burly man with a sneer permanently etched onto his face, scoffed as he looked around. "This is the village. I expected something more. Impressive." Another chuckled. "It reeks of peasants and animals. Hardly worth our time." The villagers, who had grown strong under Damian's leadership, felt their blood boil at the blatant disrespect. Some of the hunters reached for their bows, while the craftsmen tightened their grips on the tools in their hands. But before anyone could act, Damian subtly lifted a hand, signaling them to stand down. The knights barely acknowledged him as they dismounted, their eyes instead roaming over the village with thinly veiled contempt. One strode up to a woman who had been carrying a basket of fresh produce. Without a word, he snatched an apple from it and took a bite, sneering when she flinched. "Be grateful we're here to keep order." Another knight approached a group of young boys who had been stacking lumber. "Is this what passes for labor here? Pathetic. You should be ashamed of yourselves." One of the boys clenched his fists, but a hunter placed a firm hand on his shoulder, shaking his head. They had all seen Damian's cold stare from the moment the knights arrived, his piercing gaze promising retribution, but on his terms. When Damian finally stepped forward, one of the knights let out an exaggerated sigh. "So, where is your leader? I'd like to speak to him." Damian didn't flinch. "You already are." The knight blinked before throwing his head back in laughter. "You. Don't make me laugh, boy. You may have a noble's name, but you're no better than the dirt beneath my boots." The other knights snickered in agreement, speaking amongst themselves about how pathetic it was that a noble had lowered himself to live among commoners. Damian said nothing. His silence was more unsettling than anger, and those who had come to know him well understood the danger that lurked behind his calm exterior. Jasmine, standing off to the side, clenched her hands into fists, but before she could step forward, Damian shot her a look. A silent command, not yet. The knights, oblivious to the tension in the air, continued their mockery. "We've been sent to aid you, but looking at this sorry excuse for a village, I doubt even our assistance could do much." One of the younger knights smirked. "The Baron was far too generous to you. If anything, you should be groveling in gratitude for our presence." At that, a murmur rippled through the villagers, their patience wearing thin. But again, Damian remained still, his face unreadable. Finally, the lead knight folded his arms and tilted his head, scrutinizing him. "You look nothing like your brother. Jason has the bearing of a true noble, a warrior, a leader. You're a shadow in his wake." Damian's lips curled into something that was neither a smirk nor a scowl, just cold, unshaken amusement. "Is that so?" The knight snorted. "Yes, and I see no reason to listen to a whelp who abandoned his place at court to play house with commoners." It was at that moment that the villagers truly understood. Damian was not ignoring the knights out of fear, nor was he tolerating their presence out of weakness. He was watching, assessing, waiting. For what? They did not yet know, but they trusted him. Jasmine, despite her anger, found herself smiling faintly. Damian was always 10 steps ahead, even when it seemed like he was doing nothing at all. "Fine," Damian finally said, his tone neutral. "You may stay. But know this, I do not tolerate disorder in my village. If any harm comes to my people, there will be consequences." The knights burst into laughter at the audacity of his words, but Damian simply turned away, as if they weren't worth any more of his time. That, more than anything, infuriated them. And so, the game began. The knights gathered in a secluded corner of the village, their armor gleaming faintly under the pale moonlight. They spoke in hushed yet confident tones, their arrogance clear in the way they laughed amongst themselves. Jason made it clear. One of them said, arms crossed over his chest, "This village is getting too much attention. We make it look like an accident, starvation, maybe a few unfortunate incidents in the forest. Once this place falls apart, Damian will be forced to crawl back home a failure." Another knight scoffed. "And if the villagers resist?" A third smirked, unsheathing his blade slightly before sliding it back in. "Then we silence them. No one's going to miss a bunch of starving peasants. If Damian tries anything, we remind him why nobles keep men like us around. He's no warrior, he's just some whelp who got lucky." They chuckled darkly, fully believing their plan to be unstoppable. But what they didn't know was that Damian was listening. From the shadows, his body wreathed in swirling black smoke, Damian remained utterly imperceptible. His phantom archer ability cloaked him in darkness, making even the sharpest-eyed knight blind to his presence. Every word, every cruel intention, he heard with chilling clarity. His fingers tightened around his bow, his cold fury filled his chest, but he did not act yet. Not until they made their move. Later that, as the village slept, the knights approached the granary. Torches in hand, they moved with confidence, certain that nothing would stop them. "A little fire should do the trick," one muttered, striking flint to steel. Just as the first spark caught, a shadow streaked through the air, a whistle of wind, a sudden gasp, and the knight's torch fell to the ground, an ethereal black arrow piercing straight through his wrist before evaporating in a puff of smoke. He howled in pain, clutching his arm as his comrades whipped around, weapons drawn. What the? A black arrow struck, this time embedding itself into the knee of another knight before disappearing in another puff of smoke, sending him crumpling to the dirt with a strangled cry. Then, from the darkness, Damian stepped forward. Black smoke coiled around his form, his bow covered in the thick fog. His eyes burned with quiet wrath. "You should have stayed in your place," he said coldly. The knights, despite their bravado, felt unease creep down their spines. Yet some were not so easily cowed. A few among them had talents of their own. One knight charged forward, his sword igniting in white-hot flames as he swung at Damian. But the phantom archer was faster. With a flick of his fingers, he loosed 3 arrows in rapid succession, one to the man's ankle, another to his shoulder, and the third to his wrist. The knight collapsed, his fiery blade extinguished before it could ever reach its mark. Another opponent attempted to charge from behind, but Damian anticipated it. With a wave of his hand, shadowy tendrils erupted from the ground, ensnaring the knight in an unbreakable hold, his snare ability perfected. He no longer needed to fire an arrow, as he now had even more control of the shadows. The man struggled, but the darkness tightened, rendering him helpless. A particularly determined knight roared, summoning a wall of stone to protect himself before throwing a barrage of earthen spikes at Damian. But Damian merely stepped back, channeling energy into a single shot. The moment he released it, the arrow transformed into a massive projectile. His ballista shot, obliterating the stone shield and slamming in the knight's chest with devastating force. The man was flung backward, crashing into the ground, unmoving. The remaining knights, seeing their comrades fall so effortlessly, finally realized their mistake. Fear shone in their eyes as they dropped their weapons. "Pete, please! Mercy!" one begged. The villagers, awakened by the commotion, arrived at the scene, their faces a mixture of horror and awe. They had seen glimpses of Damian's strength before, but never like this. Jasmine stepped forward, her eyes locked on Damian. "What do we do with them?" she asked softly. Damian's gaze never wavered from the trembling knights. "They're going to talk." By dawn, the captured knights were forced to confess everything: their orders from Jason, their intent to sabotage the village, and their willingness to kill if necessary. Every word was documented and sent back to the Baron's estate. A few days later, a response arrived. Not from Jason, but from the Baron himself. In his chambers, Baron Eldrick gripped the letter tightly, his jaw clenched in frustration. Damian had him cornered. If word of this plot spread, it would ruin his reputation. Nobles prided themselves on control, and allowing one son to attack another would make him appear weak and dishonorable. A second letter arrived shortly after, the term set by Damian. "Punish Jason. Ensure he never interferes again, or the truth of this treachery will spread to every corner of the kingdom." The Baron exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the parchment. If he refused, his name would be stained forever. If he accepted, he would have to discipline his favored son. He had no choice. Days later, a public decree was issued from the Baron's estate. Jason was stripped of his command and publicly humiliated, forced to kneel before his father and confess to orchestrating the attack on Damian's village. His privileges as heir were revoked, and he was sentenced to live under house arrest, forbidden from leaving the estate without permission. But the worst punishment was yet to come. "Kneel," the Baron ordered. Jason gritted his teeth as he turned towards Damian, hatred burning in his eyes. But there was no escaping this. With trembling fists, he dropped to his knees before his younger brother. Damian stood tall, holding an expressionless demeanor. He said nothing. He offered no words of comfort or vengeance. He simply stared down at Jason, victorious. Basincove was his now, and no one would ever threaten it again. After the incident with the knights became public, Baron Eldrick was able to save face as a fair and impartial father, while Jason faced ridicule for his jealousy and incompetence. The nobility and common folk alike were quick to point out how Damian had transformed a dying and forgotten village into a thriving community. With his name now known throughout the land, Basincove became a beacon of hope for those who had been abandoned by the kingdom. People from neighboring villages, suffering under neglect and misfortune, began to make their way to Basincove, seeking refuge, a fresh start, and the simple promise of a place to sleep and a decent meal. Damian welcomed them all, but with conditions. Each person had to contribute to the village's well-being, to work hard, help one another, and earn their livelihood. No one was to freeload, and with his leadership, Basincove continued to flourish. As the village expanded, so did its reputation. Other nobles began to take notice. Letters started arriving, filled with offers, some seeking alliances, others attempting to attach themselves to Damian's rising fame, and many proposing marriage arrangements. Some families offered their daughters in hopes of tying their lineage to his success. But these letters never lasted long in the mansion. Jasmine made sure of that. Each time a new proposal arrived, she barely read past the first few lines before promptly tearing it to shreds. Damian, watching her growing frustration, could only chuckle as she threw the pieces into the fireplace. But when yet another letter arrived, her patience finally broke. "This is ridiculous!" Jasmine huffed, tearing the parchment apart with more force than necessary. "How many times do I have to throw these away before they get the message?" Before she could grab another, Damian suddenly wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, causing her to let out a small, startled gasp. She felt his warmth against her, his breath tickling her ear as he whispered, "You know, we could stop those letters completely." Jasmine turned slightly, her brow furrowing. "How?" Damian gently took a step back, and before she could react, he knelt on one knee. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat as he gazed up at her with nothing but love and determination in his eyes. "Because they don't know what I do," he said softly. "That I've already found the woman I want to stand beside me. That I need her, not just today, but for the rest of my life." His voice was steady, unwavering. "Jasmine, will you marry me?" Jasmine's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes with shock and overwhelming emotion. Tears welled up as she nodded furiously, trying to form words that refused to leave her throat. Finally, she managed to choke them out. "Yes!" Damian stood as she flung herself into his arms, embracing him tightly as happy tears streaked down her cheeks. He held her close, and placing a tender kiss on her forehead, before lifting her chin and kissing her deeply. sealing the promise between them. The next day, Damian and Jasmine stood before the people of Basincove to announce their engagement. The village erupted into cheers, the joy and excitement of their leader's upcoming marriage filling the air. Damian watched their smiling faces, the people who had come so far since he first arrived. He had saved them, but in return, they had given him something even more valuable, a home, a family, and a future worth fighting for. As he held Jasmine's hand, he thought of everything that lay ahead. This winter, they would rest, but in the spring, they would begin new projects, the exploration of the ravines, the construction of sturdy houses made of stone and brick, expanding the village to accommodate more people, researching new technology, and much more. Basincove would not only survive, it would prosper, and no matter what challenges came next, they would face them together.